Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to Nightlight Radio. I'm your host, Arlen Schumer. I go by Pop Culture Man. How did that happen, Pop Culture Man? Well, years ago, somehow I just said, I have so many pop culture interests, not just comics, but Twilight Zone and the music of Bruce Springsteen and other forms of pop culture, animation. And I guess I was doing my website, and I talked to my webmaster about, why don't you just get the site Pop Culture Man just in case, because I might use that one day. And that was like 15 years ago. And I had totally forgotten that I owned that website, actually, until my old webmaster reached out to me a couple of years ago and basically said, Arlen, do you want to renew that Pop Culture Man? And I said, oh, my God, now I can use it. So I'm using it presently to run my merchandise site. That's linked from my website, arlenschumer.com. It's called Pop Culture Man, and you can get posters and T-shirts. But my primary pop culture love, because it's like I have multiple pop culture children, I love each children equally. So whether it's comic book history or Twilight Zone or the music of Bruce Springsteen or other pop culture like James Bond, all of which I'll be doing webinars of with New York Adventure Club all through the fall. And tonight's show about the concept of Jews and comics is because I'll be doing a webinar next Wednesday, right before the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, on September 16th at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, my webinar on Jews and comics. And ever since I was blessed with this Nightlight radio show, only last month, when I did my first one right before my Twilight Zone webinar at the end of this, I'm able to schedule a Nightlight radio show for 2 hours before every one of my webinars coming up. So this is the second one in hopefully a series that will extend as I keep doing webinars with New York Adventure Club. So Jews and comics, what is that about? In my promotion, in the subhead, I said, Jews and comics, and I said comic books, that is, because there's obviously a long history of Jews and stand-up comedy. I mean, modern American comedy that everybody knows, Saturday Night Live, stand-up comedy, it all comes from Jewish humor, which comes out of tragedy. It comes from the immigrant experience, vaudeville, the Borscht Belt. Harvey Kurtzman, who created Mad Magazine in the early 50s, influenced the underground comic generation and National Lampoon, which begat Saturday Night Live. So all modern comedy comes out of the Jewish immigrant experience. And in a way, so do comics. And that's what Jews and comics is about. The fact that, as we're going to be talking with my guests calling in about 10 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about the fact that when we say Jews and comics, I mean, not only did Jewish men, and this was primarily men. There were hardly any women involved in the comic industry for decades. And obviously there were the few that were, but like every medium, they were kept hidden. Whether it was animation, whether it was the illustration world. So Jews in comics, not only did Jews create all the original superhero archetypes from Superman on down, but also, it was a Jew, Max Ginzburg, changed his name to Max Gaines, who created the comic book itself. He was a newspaper man. And in the early 30s, he knew that the Sunday comics, which were printed tabloid-sized and full color, he knew that they sold the newspaper more than the actual content of the paper. And he was going through some old papers one day in the early 30s, and he said, since the comics are what sell the paper, I bet you if we took it, and he sort of folded it over in half and then folded it over again and figured if we put a staple on the side, we could sell reprints of newspaper comics. At that point in the early 30s, they had been around for 3 decades. And that's how the comic book was born. And almost simultaneously, the superhero was born with the medium. I mean, I don't think ever before has a genre and a medium developed at exactly the same time, it seems, as comic books and Superman, but it was almost beshert, as we say in Hebrew, or maybe that's Yiddish, meant to be, kismet, fate. So the Jews and comics experience starts with the birth of the comic book itself, really, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight. I personally got involved with the concept of Jews in comics back in 2002, 18 years ago, which was the time of the Second Intifada by the Palestinian Arabs. And I don't know if you remember those days, but they were pretty horrible. There were bombings on buses, Jewish kids in school. There were suicide bombings. It was really horrible. And, of course, the Jews were being blamed by the media anytime they retaliated. And it was a real nightmare. And I was sitting in my studio going, how can I help Israel? I'm left-wing, leaning, liberal, tail end of the baby boom generation American Jew. On most topics, I lean left. But when it comes to Israel, I guess I'm pretty right-wing. But I was trying to figure out, how can I help Israel? I don't have the money to send over to Israel, but I thought about the origin of Captain America, which I knew of. I've lectured on Jack Kirby and his creations, and Captain America being one of his greatest, co-created with another American Jew named Jaime Simon, changed his name to Joe Simon, just like Jakob Kurtzberg changed his name to Jack Kirby. But how did they come to create Captain America? Well, Captain America was published 9 months before we went into the war, because Jews were hearing stories about what was happening in Europe since Hitler came to power. And they were terrible stories. And obviously, the horrors of the Holocaust did not fully come out till after the war, but there were enough advance warnings and notices that American Jews were aware that it was a horrible situation in Europe. And basically, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon were 2 young comic book dynamos working for the comic book companies, the nation comic book companies at the time. And they were like, how can we help? And they said they created Captain America to basically enlighten the American public via comic books, which were super popular, pun intended, at that time. And they said, we'll create a patriotic superhero. And that's what Captain America was. And it was so instantly popular, a smash success, that they actually dressed up actors as Captain America to stump for war bonds. Because you got to know your history. America was isolationist at the time. They didn't want to fight Europe's war, as they called it. And they figured World War I was only 20 years earlier, was still a fresh memory. And America was not going to fight a war to, quote, save the Jews. And that's, by the way, a whole other story. But they wanted to raise the consciousness, Simon and Kirby, to what was happening, and they did it with Captain America. And it did the job. Overnight success is really the third iconic superhero after Batman, is Captain America, really. More so than I would say Captain Marvel. And America goes into the war 9 months later. So I figured, sitting in Westport, Connecticut in my garage studio, what can I do? I figured if two American Jews can create Captain America, one American Jew can create Captain Israel. So I created a Jewish superhero, and I was a kind of wandering isolationist Jew. I didn't have any connections to Jewish organizations, but I tried to kind of use this character, and I tried to, quote, sell him to Jewish organizations during that year, and nobody was interested. Meaning I wanted to use the medium of comics, whether it was in print, online, to tell Israel's side of the story, using Captain Israel as the kind of talking to the reader spokesperson. Anyway, nothing happened in 2002. Flash forward, it's 2010, and an organization based in Los Angeles reaches out to me called Stand With Us. And long story short, they wanted to publish Captain Israel, and I ended up doing two small page comic books, meaning the first one was 8 pages, the second one was 12 pages. But they were full color, and I wrote and illustrated both of them. The first one was about just the origin of Israel, because there's so many misconceptions about that. Most people don't realize that even the name Palestine was created by the Romans after they exiled all the Jews after the wars with the Jews, and the Jews were a crushed people, and they were exiled, and Rome renamed the land that they called Judea or Judah in Hebrew, and to add insult to injury, they named the land after the Philistines, who were the Jews' biblical enemies. And that's where you get the name Palestine from. The bottom line is that's the historical fact. And that was the first issue, Captain Israel, 2010. The second one I did in 2011, which was all about the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction, which that was 2011. I mean, this is 9 years later. It's still going strong. And I did a 12-page thing about that. I don't think those are posted at my website. I'm not sure. But anyway, very soon we'll be joined by my guest for tonight, named Joel Silverstein, who I've known, I would say, for maybe somewhere around 10 years. And hey, Joel is a painter.
Arlen?
Yeah,
Arlen?
hi.
Hi,
yes,
Joel
hi,
is here.
Well, I was just saying his name. His ears must be burning. Hey, Joel.
I guess so.
Hey, Arlen, are we on?
We're on. Do you hear me?
Hey. Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Joel, do you have your computer on? Do you see the website that people can? Yeah. By the way, everybody, before I fully introduce Joel, I should mention that you can call in during the almost 2 hours we will be on air tonight at 773-897-6114. And you'll talk to Barbara DeLong, who will take your name and put you on with us when we get a break in our conversation with my friend Joel, who, as I was saying, is a painter, a fine art painter, and a teacher of art, and he's been heavily involved in Jewish organizations and causes. He's been written up in major art magazines and books about the Jewish art experience. I have one right here at hand. Jewish Identity and in American Art. There's a whole chapter on Joel's work. But Joel's work mixes motifs from the comic world with fine art, which is something that's always interested me. I've done a lecture, a visual lecture, as I call them, about the relationship between fine art and comic book art. And because of my Jewish involvement and the pride I feel in being Jewish, I think, Joel, that's how we met. Refresh my memory. Wasn't it about 10 years ago? But ladies and gentlemen, Joel Silverstein. Hi, Joel.
Hi, everybody. How you doing? Okay. Hey, Arlen, I just want to thank you again. This is not only is it a great opportunity, but as we've spoken about many times, this is one of my favorite topics in the whole world because it's so deep, so rich. And like you said, not only is it the creation of a medium, it's the creation of a genre and a medium at the same time, which is why I think it's lasted 80 years. Like you were saying. So I there's so much to talk about in that regard. So
right. By the way,
okay.
Before we get going, Joel, let me just also tell people I was too busy blabbing about my background. I should have said this right up front, but everybody, if they're listening in, they should make sure they go to the website, blogtalkradio.com/night-light. You'll see the Jews and Comics, and you can follow along with us. There are images scrolling from my forthcoming Jews and Comics webinar that maybe as Joel and I talk extemporaneously, we will touch upon some of those images because I think I chose like the cream of the crop imagery to run while we're talking. Okay, right. Joel, I cut you off. Finish what you were saying.
Well, I just wanted to add, I'm not just an artist, which I'm very grateful about and love very much, but I'm, just to bring it up, one of the founding members of the Jewish Art Salon, which we feel we're on the cusp of contemporary Jewish art. And I've been very involved with Jews and Comics today. So I've curated I've curated about 15 shows, 10 to 15 shows for the Jewish Art Salon, all contemporary Jewish art themes, some historical, some regular art, contemporary art. But because I love comics so much, we did 3 exhibitions on Jewish art.
Were these all in the New York area? Were these all in the New York area?
Yeah. You want me to name them? Just to bring it up because it's interesting. The first one we did was called Jomics, and that was for UJA in New York and the Philadelphia Museum of Jewish Art, and we had a lot of great artists, some of which we'll bring up tonight, their names and stuff. The second one we did was I worked with Fred Polanecki, who I hope is listening tonight, but if he's not, he was in charge. He ran Jewish Comic-Con in Brooklyn, and that's where we also, worked together a little bit. And that is the whole contemporary scene of like young Jewish comic book artists who are doing not just regular comics but also Jewish comics, and we'll talk about that tonight too. Autobiographical comics about the Holocaust, all kinds of stuff. It's like amazing. And then the third show we did was about diversity, and I was a art teacher on the Lower East Side for 20 years or 18 years, and I got very involved with the art organizations down there. And we did a show in Brooklyn at a place called Repair the World called Convivio, which was Jews and Hispanics in the comics. Because that neighborhood where Jack Kirby was born and was raised on the Lower East Side was very Jewish. It was Irish originally, then it was Jewish, then it became Hispanic, and then it became Jewish again. So the artist who came from, I think, what's his name, Joe Quesada, I think comes from Manhattan like that, and he's a Dominican artist. There were other Hispanic artists who looked to the Jewish artists as their role model, and they realized that they were alienated and they were outsiders. And so there are a lot of, Hispanic artists kind of like taking that as a lesson for their own experience, So
absolutely.
We got to do that show. So I'm just saying there were so many different points in this topic, historical and aesthetic and, sociological and, religious. We'll talk about, I hope we get to talk about Jewish comics and, kind of like mythic or religious themes. So we could talk about that too. So I just wanted to get that in.
Yeah. I mean, listen, that's what my webinar is about. It's such a rich topic. You can't cover everything. You have to do a certain amount of editing whenever you do, whether it's a documentary film or whether you're doing a lecture. You have to, editing is part of the whole process. But I was talking, Joel, right before you came on. Yeah. I was segueing from my Captain Israel character, that kicked off my real involvement with Jews and comics.
Right.
And on the logo for my Jews and Comics webinar, I still use the character. But I was basically saying that was me as an American Jew creating Captain Israel in the same way two American Jews named Jaime Simon and Yaakov Ginzburg, a.k.a. Joe Simon, Jack Kirby, created Captain America. And I mean, I based my Captain Israel, the costume and everything, totally on Captain America, just using Jewish and Israel imagery. So maybe that would be a good point to start, because in terms of superhero comics, I mean, yeah, we all know Jews created Superman. They created Batman. I jumped in with Captain America only because it was a segue from my Captain Israel. But pretty much my webinar, chronologically, I start with Max Ginzburg, who, by the way, changed his name to Gaines.
Right.
And his son, Bill Gaines, ended up being the publisher and co-editor of the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, the EC horror, science fiction, and war comics of the early 50s that were the first anti-war comics, the first comics about the Holocaust, about anti-Semitism in the early 50s. And out of that came Harvey Kurtzman and Mad, which is the birth of American humor. So many, but like I said, so his father, Max Gaines, a.k.a. Ginzburg, creates the American comic book. And I go from there to Superman. Anywhere you want to jump in, we can begin talking about.
Sure.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
I wanted to bring up your character because you gave me a copy of that, and you gave me a poster at that time at Jewish Comic Con. So.
Right.
You know, and what's neat about that is you might say it's a full circle. You know what I mean? So, you know, Simon and Kirby in 41, like you said, 7 months before the war, they're dealing with the issue of rising fascism. And, you know, for people in America, I have this conversation all the time. For people in America who are younger, and especially younger Jewish people, they don't realize how difficult it was in those days to be Jewish. So I just want to say, while Hitler was rising, the Nazis held a rally in Madison Square Garden, the American Silver Shirts.
They made a documentary film recently.
They did.
I forget what it's called. It came out about a year ago. And I think you can find it on YouTube. But yeah.
Right.
Yeah, right.
20,000 American Nazis.
Of course. Listen.
Right. So people don't realize that, you know.
Well, you know, listen, this gets into the plight of American Jews. Not to go off on a tangent, but, you know, our generation didn't experience the overt anti-Semitism. I mean, I remember my stepfather saying that he grew up in Newark, New Jersey.
Right.
And he remembers as a teenager walking down the street in Newark, and a gang of, you know, youths pulled up in a car. They asked him if he was Jewish. He said yes, and they got out of the car and they beat the crap out of him.
Right.
Now, I guarantee you, your average American Jew of our generation never experienced that. We experienced some.
Yeah.
So how do you impart to a younger audience that's grown up in nice, safe America? And this is what, listen, don't Israeli Jews, they look down on American Jews. They think, oh, you don't know what it's like to be surrounded by bloodthirsty enemies who want to murder us.
Right.
And American Jews. But here's the thing. We all were taught by our parents' generation through the Depression and World War II and the Holocaust. We were taught that, oh, man, what was my train of thought? I was just saying, oh, man.
About Israel and American Jews and how American Jews have kind of lost touch with that kind of overt anti-Semitism.
You're like the script girl on a movie. You're keeping continuity.
It's okay.
We were always told that the German Jews were the last to leave because they considered themselves German first and Jews second.
Right.
Because Germany was the height of European culture, science, mathematics, literature, art, everything. And they were German Jews, but they were German first.
Right.
Well, guess what? In the end, they were thrown into the ovens like everyone else.
Right, right.
And here's the thing. I believe our generation of American Jews are similar. We, and I use the editorial we consider ourselves Americans first,
right,
and Jews second. And the only problem, and that's also because we're white, and we can, quote, fit in with Gentile American Christian society.
Right, right.
But here's the thing. What a lot of American Jews, and this gets to your point about them not realizing things, they don't realize, like the Ku Klux Klan hates Jews more than they hate black people.
Yeah, right.
You know,
right.
We are still number one hated worldwide.
Right.
And American Jews don't realize that we are Jews before we are white. We are Jews before we are Americans in the eyes of the enemy.
Right, right, absolutely.
And
Racist,
by the
Nazis.
Way, and by the way, and there's some, and as you know, who said, oh well, there are some good people on both sides.
Right,
but what happened in Germany in the 30s,
right,
where your best friends and your relatives became Hitlerites, is unfortunately what's happening now with you know who. Now, remember I said we'll go on a tangent.
Right.
This is what happens when you start talking Jews in comics.
Right.
And you get into tangents because what they were fighting 60, 70 years ago, we're still fighting today. But where were we in terms of Jews and comics?
Can I segue with some?
Yeah.
Like, I taught on the Lower East Side, right? So I was trying to trace Jack Kirby's life from his interviews and stuff like that. So he was born on Essex Street. He was raised on Suffolk Street. That was like 1 block from where my studio was. It was 2 blocks from the school that I taught at. My grandfather had a store on Essex Street, you know. And Kirby's stories was that, first of all, the Lower East Side in those days was so crowded. It was supposed to be the most crowded spot on earth, right?
Yeah.
Kids had no place to play, and there were all these gangs, right? And so the gangs had to be affiliated in order to protect themselves. So, you know, look, the Christian gangs were the Irish and the Italians down there, and the Jewish kids, right? And so Kirby was forced into this position of they would scamper over rooftops. I mean, they didn't have guns in those days, kids, but they had bats, brick bats, and knives and all that stuff.
They were throwing bricks at each other.
Right,
you know,
right.
He wrote and drew an autobiographical story, very, very well known because it was the only time he did it. Street Code.
Street Code, yeah.
I think he drew it in the 80s. Got published in 1990. It's the only real insight Kirby ever really wrote and drew about growing up on the Lower East Side. But all of Kirby's fight scenes that he became famous for, the movement, the action, being able to draw that two-dimensionally, all comes from his real-life experiences in this rough and tumble and sounds like quite serious and dangerous world. I mean, you know, I grew up in safe, you know, northern New Jersey. Again, I didn't travel with gangs. I was in suburbia. But I remember coming a little close to some experiences like Kirby's, and I mean, they scared me to death. And to think that Kirby was living that almost every day.
Right, as a kid, right.
Where I remember, like, I mean, this gets into bullying and concepts we're familiar with today, but, you know, the brief brush I had with those kind of physically threatening childhood experiences, I'm very fortunate that I only had maybe less than 1 handful of them. But you know what? Each one of them was traumatic in the moment. And the fact that I can remember each one shows you how traumatic they are. Just like any traumatic experience, creative people, you know, they try instinctively, subconsciously to harness those traumas and cathartically convert it into positive energy via their art. And that's basically what Kirby did, like a lot of artists.
Can I bring up another example, too?
Yeah. You never have to ask permission. Just jump in and do it.
I don't want to cut you off. We're talking about it. One of my favorite graphic novels is Eisner's To the Heart of the Storm. And my dad was in World War II. Okay, my dad saw action for 3.5 years. So this is about Eisner.
Tell people what that's about.
All right. So Eisner, we'll talk about Will Eisner and the spirit and everything later in his life. Later in his life, Will Eisner he didn't invent it, but he introduced it, like the graphic novel, into America. You know, there were earlier...
In the modern era.
Right. He decides to introduce first Contract with God. I think it's 1976 or something like that, and then a whole series
78.
of them. 78? Okay. I remember I was like right after high school it came out. It was very strange because it wasn't super heroic. He really went out on a tangent.
And it was published by a real publisher.
Right, as a book.
And he actually called it a graphic novel.
Right.
He pitched it as such. So even though technically there are other examples of, quote, graphic novels. I mean, look, Gil Kane, a superhero artist, did Black Mark in 1970. That's a graphic novel, but he's not given the credit. So we listen, we can do a whole webinar and a whole 2 hours on just the origin of the graphic novel. But
one of these guys.
Suffice it to say,
I brought it up for a reason. The reason is, like, In the Heart of the Storm, it's about him growing up in the Bronx. He was born in Brooklyn, but he goes to the Bronx, right? His little brother's name is Julian, like Julian. And the kids in the area, these, like, tough kids, they keep on going, Julian, and they're calling him Jew, and they beat the crap out of his little brother. Eisner goes, from now on, your name is Pete. Right, and it's supposed to be like a true story, like those stories that he wrote in the novel.
I never knew that story.
Yeah, it's not made up. It really happened, and his brother's name was Pete. You know?
No, but wait. But are you saying he drew that as a story?
Yes. It's in Heart of the Storm.
And where is that? That's in the Heart of the Storm?
Heart of the Storm, yeah, exactly. It's really sad, that story, because he's a kid.
But is it a Romana Clef in the Heart of the Storm? Or is it's not actually Will Eisner, the characters?
He's called Willie. I mean, he is and he's not. You know what I mean?
But what I'm saying is there is a story about his brother named Julian changing his name to Pete?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't remember that. I got to go back to my old Eisner. Anyways, yes, go on.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I bring it up, too, and it really first of all, I grew up in Brooklyn where it was tougher. It definitely was. I grew up in Bensonhurst. My dad was born on the Lower East Side. He wound up in Bensonhurst. There was still, there was that tension between Jews and non-Jews, in that regard.
Of course.
It was kind of, right.
Of course.
So Eisner documents having a friend, and it's kind of like his friend was like this Irish kid. I forgot his name in the story. And it was in the Bronx where there was anti-Semitism. And again, it's not to disparage, those people, who were that, but this is a story about anti-Semitism. And they're really good friends as kids, and they.
By the way, Joe.
Yeah.
Anti-Semites should always be chastised.
But no.
It doesn't matter what they were anti-Semites.
Exactly.
You don't have to make excuses for them.
No, I'm not making excuses. I just want to say.
No, but why are you saying not to condemn them? Well, they should be condemned for being anti-Semites.
No, for being anti-Semites, yes. Okay, fine.
Yeah,
so anyway,
hello.
he built this
Arlen?
boat.
Yeah, hi, Barbara.
Excuse me for interrupting. You have a caller. Reed is on the line. Would you like me to open his mic?
Oh, sure. Why not?
Sure.
Okay. Reed, you're
Hello.
on.
Thank you. Hey, I was wondering what you feel about Dick Tracy, because I got the drawing next to me.
Well, what about Dick Tracy?
It's a comic book, and I was wondering if you enjoyed it or if you feel that it's a good representation.
Okay, but I'm sorry, but that has nothing to do with the topic of Jews and comics.
Oh, well, it's
you have
a comic.
Question about Jews? Yeah, but we're talking specifically about Jews and comics tonight. It's not a general comic call-in. But thank you for your call.
All right.
Joel, can we go back to Joel?
Yeah, we are. That was interesting. To be nice, I was going to say Dick Tracy was a big influence on Bob Kane.
Okay. Excuse me. Barbara, can you come back on?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah.
Barbara?
Yes, I'm here.
Barbara, the phone calls tonight should really only be about the topic Jews and comics. If you're going to screen them, this guy was just talking about Dick Tracy.
No, I am screening him. He said it was about Jews and comics. This happens
Okay,
often.
well,
he didn't know. Okay, whatever.
You know what? I think we're okay. Can you get him off the phone now?
He's gone.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So the reason why
wait, Joe, hold on a second. Barbara, I just want to say, I think let's hold off on calls until Joel and I reach a point when we feel we're done talking. I'd rather let me talk with Joel first, And then if there's time, we'll take calls at the end of the show, okay?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Because
I
don't want to take the risk of a call like that interrupting our flow, because that was really, I would call that a, quote, bad phone call.
Right.
But, Joel, do you remember where we were? Do you remember where we were,
yes.
Joel?
Because I love this story so much, okay, and it really reminds me of my dad, right? Okay, so he has a friend, and the friend's like a little Irish kid, and they're so naive, like they don't know what's going on, and the neighborhood's very tough, and the Jewish kids are getting beaten up and everything. They become friends, right? They bond over building a boat in the basement of the apartment house, right? And they really want to do it, so they learn how to do it and everything like that, and then they find that the boat is too big, they can't get it out of the basement. Okay.
Wait, why are they building a boat?
It's like a hobby. It's like, you know, like a fishing.
But they're in Brooklyn and they're building a boat.
Yes, they're
the
building
Bronx,
a boat.
and they're building
a hobby.
Boat.
Learning how to woodwork together. They become really pals and everything, and they become really good friends. Okay. And they can't get the boat out of the basement. So it's one of those kid things, like a dead idea that, oh, my God. So they always share that we built this boat, we couldn't get it out of the basement, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is years later, Willie goes off to war. Okay, he winds up meeting the guy. He's grown already. So let's say he's drafted. So he's 18, 20, I don't know. He meets the guy, and they meet, and they're talking. I think they're eating together. And the guy lets it out that, you know, like first they start talking and they go, you know, you Jews, the problem with you Jews are, and he's like so taken aback that his friend is really anti-Semitic. And it kind of like, he's, well, you're a good one, but, you know.
Right.
You know how Eisner does those things, like it's very hyper-emotional in Eisner. So it's really, I was going to say, like Yiddish theater, right? They close in on Will's face, and he's like, he's crying, like he's shedding this tear that he really had this pal. And the guy turns out to be a horrid anti-Semite. You know, and it's like that's what these guys were like facing. It wasn't like a mild thing. So, you know, those examples like readily come to mind.
But hasn't everybody listening in, or any American Jew, haven't we all had these kind of experiences where even, I used to say this, even your most educated Gentile Christian friends, every now and then they'll let slip something like, oh, did you Jew him down? They'll say something or reveal, and this gets into the larger issues of anti-Semitism, particularly in America. Where does it come from?
Right.
And this is the hard, bitter truth that Christians don't want to hear. But anti-Semitism goes back. It's in the New Testament itself. It's built in the charge of deicide. The fact that the Jews were the losers against Rome begins this idea that the Jews are the bad guys. Christ went up against the Jews. You got to remember, he was very okay with the Romans. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. He praised the Jewish centurion as He praised the Roman centurion as having greater faith than anyone in Israel. Rome is portrayed in the New Testament as beneficent to the point where even Pontius Pilate
he's a good
gets
guy
to wash his hands. Again, without going off into a tangent, the problem with anti-Semitism is that when you keep going back, finding out the source down through the ages, guess what, folks? It's right there, and this is why your best Gentile friends, every now and then, they were raised with it. They were born with it in a way. It's ingrained in their growing up that Jews are the other. We killed Christ. Educated people in the 21st century are still going on about that. You know, it's funny. You know, Germans who were twice removed from World War II, they're bummed out that they feel like they're still paying the price for their Nazi grandparents. And they're like, when are we going to be done with this guilt? And as a Jew, I'm going, really, Germany? Hold my beer, as they say. We're still dealing with 2,000 years of you killed Christ. Now, all I'm going to say to wrap up this little part of our theological discussion is that I will say to Christians, you can't have your Christ and eat him too. And what I mean by that, if he was meant to die for mankind's sins by God himself, he so loved the earth that he gave his only begotten Son out of love for human beings to forgive them of their sins. God orchestrated his own Son's death. He had to die the way he died.
Right.
And so you can't both profess to believe in a crucified Christ who resurrected by the power of God, and at the same time blame God's instrument, which was the Jewish Sanhedrin at the time, the Vichy government, so to speak, of Judea at the time. You can't blame them. They were God's instrument.
Right.
So you can't have your belief in God and Christ and also say, oh, but by the way, God, I hate the Jews for what they did to Christ. And God is saying, you idiots, I used my people to kill my own son for a purpose. And you can't believe in that and not believe in the other.
Okay.
And that is the final word on the anti-Semitic.
Right,
yeah.
good.
Back to Jews and comics.
Okay, Jews and comics is this, right, which is really interesting. Can we shift now into – I keep on thinking of Siegel and Shuster because there's so much of that in Siegel and Shuster.
Well, why don't we, for the benefit of our audience, why don't we do the Siegel and Shuster Superman Jewish discussion, which, again, we could fill up 2 hours just on that.
Exactly.
But why don't we spend a little time on the big kahuna?
Okay, sure. So you want me to start now? We take turns. I'll throw it over to you, or how do you do this?
I'm giving you the introduction.
Okay, all right. So this is the interesting thing, okay? There had been a history of pulp heroes. There's like Doc Savage and kind of like those kind of he-men, strongmen kind of figures. And like Arlen said before, you have the rise of the comic book at the exact right time. It's the kind of like the height of the Depression. Jewish people cannot get jobs in the art world, like at that time. In other words, like advertising was really censored and sequestered, against Jews. Illustration, they had really a hard time getting into. Architecture, all those kind of fields that were protected by the Americans who had gotten here before, Jews couldn't get into, okay?
The white Christian, the white Protestant Christian power base in America that is still in control of America.
Right. But at that time, Jews couldn't get in. I mean, now they can get in, thank God.
Of course.
But anyway,
the movie Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck in the mid-50s
perfectly.
is also about working in a magazine and the Jews. And people get in. Modern young people don't realize that, yes, most mainstream occupations were off limits to Jews.
Right. And especially creative art ones.
Country clubs.
Right. So anyway, so these kids who were young, okay, so you realize Siegel and Shuster and Joe Kubert and Kirby, they were teenagers. It was unbelievable.
Of course.
All right. So Siegel and Shuster, they don't live in New York. They live in Cleveland, right? And Cleveland actually had a big Jewish population. So,
but one of them is from Toronto. Who was from Toronto?
He was born there, but he moved to Cleveland.
Siegel
he was the artist. Jerry Siegel was the writer. Joe Shuster was the artist, right?
Which one was Canadian? The
artist, Joe Shuster.
Okay.
Actually, if Julian is listening tonight, Julian wrote a great book. Julian Volach wrote a great book called The Men Behind Superman. No, it's Volach. He's German. Anyway, whatever. Okay. He wrote this book called The Men Behind Superman, and it's about Siegel and Shuster, but mostly Shuster.
It's a graphic novel.
In a graphic novel form. It's fantastic.
Oh, you got to tell people what it is.
Yes.
It's a graphic novel.
Graphic novel, but it's a great, fantastic book. Okay. So anyway, these two kids are in Cleveland. Jerry Siegel is a horrible student. His dad has a secondhand clothing store. His dad always wants him to go into the business, right? He says, no, Dad, I want to write my science fiction stories, right? He really was involved with science fiction. He was, again, a crappy student and everything like that. It starts developing in a certain way, right? And at that time, which you mentioned in your webinar, which came out many years later, by the way, his dad had, in the secondhand clothing store, 3 guys break into the store, hold a gun to him, right? And it's mixed what happened. Some people, originally they said he got shot, then they said he died of a heart attack the next day. But his dad dies like that, just like in a superhero book, just like in Batman or anything else, right? So I think he was 16 when his dad died.
Right.
Right? Okay. He's writing these fanzines already, the science fiction fanzines. He discovers, and they go to Glendale High School, I think, or Glenwood High School. It's in Cleveland, mostly Jewish. Had kind of like a newspaper that they do these things for. That's where he writes. He writes a parody of Tarzan called Goober the Great or something, Goober the Mighty, right? And so he's experimenting with these characters. The first story he comes up with is this thing called Reign of the Superman, and it's a lot like Lex Luthor. He's like a big-headed, baldy kind of guy.
But he's a villain. The key
thing
is he's a villain.
He's a villain.
So isn't it interesting that Superman is originally a villain who's bald and looks like Lex Luthor, who wouldn't be created till years later? Right. Now, all these things, as Arlen and I both said, all these things are stirring around. It's the height of the Depression. They don't have money, right? They're Jewish kids. They're nerdy. They're like kind of little funny looking. They're awkward. People who, like most American Jews, most teenagers, who
but
fit
even
into
more
that mold. Yeah.
Even more. Girls ignored them. Supposedly, Lois Amster was the girl that Lois Lane was based on. She said, "Who? Who?" She didn't even remember him. She said, "Oh yeah, he was this weird kid," like that. Anyway, okay. So all the while, for Jewish kids, for Kirby and Eisner, and for Siegel and Shuster, the big thing was newspaper strips in the 30s. If you Flash Gordon, Tarzan, Mandrake the Magician, the Phantom,
Dick Tracy.
Yeah, Dick Tracy, the caller called that in. Actually, Dick Tracy is the prototype, in a way, for the Batman universe, with like the ugly villains that have horrible faces.
Yeah,
and stuff.
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So they decide to try to put together this as a newspaper strip first, right? And they get turned down, 20 times or something. It's like amazing.
Yep.
They go, the drawing's very crude. They're kids. They're really kids. But there's something so pure about this, right? So, as a kid myself, one of the first books I discovered was Steranko's History of Comics. It was like 1972. I was in high school. One of the first conventions, when it was still Creation Con or whatever. And in that book, they described the origin of Superman, right? And it's really the myth. It's not the real origin. It's kind of like what Jerry Siegel said. He's got one night. It was a hot summer, and there's no air conditioning. The window was open, and I looked out, and I wanted to fly. Like, could I fly? And could I be invincible? And like that.
Well, no. Well, according to Steranko, and this is from Volume 1 of History Comics that came out in 1970.
Right.
He said, "Up above the clouds must be cool air. If only I could get above the clouds.
Wow.
If only I could fly, ...
Wow.
And supposedly, according to Steranko, and I'm assuming Steranko got this directly from Siegel, because Siegel was alive in the early. So the point is that is the origin of Steranko down, that he was so excited he couldn't go back to sleep. He wrote the rest of the night, and he ran over to his friend Joe Shuster in the morning, and Shuster starts drawing the character, and literally the rest is history.
Right, exactly. Now, supposedly other books say that this is like a later fabrication, because the Superman story developed very slowly. And if you remember, Superman didn't fly until the radio, until the cartoon.
No.
1941.
Okay, but slow down, Joe. Slow down.
Yeah.
What are you saying? If you're saying that the idea of the hot summer night is a fabrication,
not a fabrication, mythic.
But what are you saying then is the quote real origin of Superman then?
Listen, it's like anything else, Arlen. Any creative activity, anything in history, sometimes it's developmental, and people remember it as instant.
I'm asking you a direct question. You basically are saying.
I've read other writers who said it was developmental. It wasn't instant like that. But he's saying it was. So, okay. I'm saying that's a beautiful passage. It changed my life, reading Steranko's history. I have to say that. Reading that passage changed my life.
Well, it's funny you say that, because Steranko wrote something about Superman.
Right.
In that, it's funny you say that, because to people listening in that don't know what we're talking about, a great American comic artist and writer named Jim Steranko, one of the gods of comic book art in the late 60s.
Right.
He left comics in 1970, and that year came out with the first of 2 volumes that are large tabloid-sized softcover books, and they're called The History of Comics, and they really only cover, both volumes put together, cover the 1940s, really.
Right, golden age.
They don't go past that, but Steranko is as great of a prose writer, I always thought, as he was a writer of comic books and an artist.
Right.
I believe his History of Comics is still, for that era of the 1940s, it's the greatest history. I think Gerard Jones, who wrote the book Men of Tomorrow.
Right.
Did you ever read that, Joel?
Yeah,
Men of Tomorrow?
We talked about it. Yeah.
Right. Oh, yeah. And fortunately, of course, Gerard Jones was recently sentenced to 5 years in prison for child pornography. But I digress.
That's another story.
The point is he did write a great book. But here's what I want to talk about: the origin of Superman vis-a-vis Jews and comics.
Right.
Because, and this is something that is a theme running throughout a lot of my history. Right. I always maintain that artists sometimes create things out of a conscious reason that they can articulate. Sometimes they create things subconsciously or unconsciously from their childhood experiences or from what they were absorbing in the world around them.
Absolutely.
Now, I think it was Jules Feiffer who wrote the first great history of comics, Steranko's, which was called The Great Comic Heroes, came out in late 1965, which is really just a collection of essays about the early comic book superheroes like Superman.
Right.
Feiffer got to reprint origin stories of each of these 8 or 10 superheroes, combined with really witty, as only Feiffer can write them, essays, because Feiffer was a kid in the early 40s growing up with these superheroes. So he was the first one in mainstream American intellectual discussion in 1965 to say Superman wasn't leaving Krypton, he was escaping Minsk. Meaning
Poland,
he was basically, Feiffer was basically saying, hey, we know the origin of Superman, Krypton, and all that, but, and we know that Siegel and Shuster were just 2 kids trying to hustle. You know, it's funny. They used to watch the Popeye cartoons by the Fleischer Studios during the 30s.
Exactly.
And they would see this guy eat spinach and do these, quote, superhuman feats. And they actually say to each other, you know, Popeye was drawn cartoonish. Not realistic human proportions. Right. But one of them said, you know, if we could take Popeye and treat him more as a realistic adventure strip character, we would have something. Absolutely. Now, when you said, Joel, Superman was developmental, this is part of the development. Right. But what I'm saying from a Jews and comics perspective is that there's this whole philosophy, and like I said, Feiffer brought it up first, that Siegel and Shuster subconsciously were creating a hero born of the Jewish immigrant experience who leaves Europe, which was the equivalent of Krypton blowing itself up, which is what Europe did in World War II. It destroyed itself.
Right, absolutely.
And comes to America, which mirrors the whole Jewish immigrant experience. He comes to America, and what is his name? I mean, can you get any more Gentile than Clark Kent? Right. And the idea of Superman being from Kansas, I mean, right in the middle, you couldn't have picked a more Gentile cliche upbringing in America than, you know, a guy named Clark Kent coming out of Kansas, but created by Jews. So subconsciously or unconsciously, they were like Jews of the past, and this is what we get into when we talk about the biblical heroes like Samson, or even
King David, Moses,
and even Jesus himself, in the sense of we need a hero. Say the Jewish sages, the Jewish prophets, the great Jewish writers, Society is crumbling. It's threatening. The Golem myth that we're going to get into.
Right.
The Golem myth, created by Rabbi Love from Prague in Czechoslovakia in the early 17th century. He's a guy, a rabbi, that wanted to help the Jews that were being murdered by the pogroms of the surrounding Gentiles.
Right.
Pogroms were like state-sanctioned riots in which usually around Easter, when they would all get drunk Easter Sunday and then go out and slaughter the Jewish communities.
Right.
And this was if you've seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, right in the middle of the film, they're busy having a wedding, and the Cossacks come, and they rape and pillage. And we all have stories of our grandmothers hiding in the mattress while the Cossacks came. And again, American Jews have no concept of what it must have been like for all of a sudden to hear the sound of thundering hoofs and know that drunken Christians were coming to rape, rob, murder, and pillage your community. And out of that experience, Rabbi Love, the legend goes of the Golem, is that he creates a being out of clay, and views it with life. Remember, it doesn't have a brain or a soul, but it has life, and it's a giant wrestler-type being made out of clay in order to protect the Jewish people. And at first, according to the legend, it does do that, and it only hurts the marauding Christians. But after a while, because it has no mind or soul, it starts murdering everyone, including Jews. So Rabbi Love has to put the Golem down, and according to legend, somewhere up in the attic in the famous Prague synagogue, the body of the Golem. But the bottom line is that story, 200 years later, is reimagined by Mary Shelley as Frankenstein. Because that's and listen, we know all about the origin of Frankenstein. She was away for the weekend with all the boys, and they had their great experiences, and she comes up with Frankenstein. Well, I think the Jewish myth of the Golem had been around Europe for 200 years.
She had supposedly heard of it. She had supposedly heard about it. She
again,
did.
Or subconsciously or unconsciously. So why is the Golem myth in particular? Superman is a type of Golem. Batman is a type of Golem. Captain America is a type of Golem, meaning they were conjured. Now, Rabbi Love conjured him up consciously, whereas our young American Jews like Simon and Kirby and Siegel and Shuster and Bob Kane and Bill Finger, who created Batman, they were all unconscious, and this is what I mean vis-a-vis Jews and comics. They were unconsciously or subconsciously creating heroes to help fight what they sense in the ether in the mid to late 30s as the rising tide of anti-Semitism, of fascism, which all ended up, of course. So it's no coincidence that as historians, we look back at this interesting period of time when all of a sudden, from out of the lowest depths of American pop culture, immigrant trash, just like the elites thought movies were in the early 20th century. Immigrant trash entertainment. Out of this immigrant trash come 20th century mythological Jewish-based heroes in order to by proxy, fight against this rising tide. Now, again, Simon and Kirby consciously created Captain America to do that. Whereas Siegel and Shuster, Bob. Now, you mentioned Siegel's dad dying from the thing. Well, look at the origin of Batman. Based in the 30s during the Depression, armed robberies were at an all-time high. People were getting held up in the street. Blah blah blah. But here's what you have to remember: since Batman was created after Superman. Bob Kane, the original co-creator of Batman, by the way, real name Robert Kahn, Kahn, changed his name. You know, some Jews like Will Eisner did not change their name. Other Jews did. But here's the thing. Siegel and Shuster were working in New York City for DC Comics at the time in the office. And when Superman becomes an overnight success in the spring of 1938, Bob Kane is also working for the Young DC Comics, doing cartoon. He had a cartoony style, and he's doing backup strips for this new DC Comics, making a chump change. But he's seeing Siegel and Shuster making money overnight on Superman. And they've got to hire other artists and, Action Comics. Superman gets his own title, blah, blah, blah. The rest is history. Bob Kane's sitting there. He's trying to hustle. And he had grew up poor, and his father was in the garment district, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, they were from the Bronx, right?
Went to the same high school, DeWitt Clinton.
Yeah, DeWitt Clinton.
Eisner went to, that Stan Lee
went. Bill Finger, right.
Right, Bill Finger, Stan Lee, they all went to this DeWitt Clinton. But the point is, they all came out of the same Jewish bouillabaisse in which most Jews were supposed to go into their father's business.
Right.
I think
Absolutely.
Kane's father was also, but the point is that Kane is sitting there watching Siegel and Shuster making money, and he says to the editor of Action Comics, named Vince Sullivan, how do I get in on that action? And Vince Sullivan said, create your own superhero.
Right.
So, story goes, Bob Kane goes home, and is the partner writer he was working with for the past couple of years on those cartoony strips, like Rusty and His Pals, a knockoff of Terry and the Pirate. They concoct Batman one weekend, and of course, Bob Kane claims sole credit. We could do a whole. I've done a whole webinar just on the Bob Kane.
You actually did a brilliant article that I saw about the artwork tracing and everything. And I mean, Bill Finger obviously really was like 75% or 80% of it. I mean, it just seems pretty evident.
Exactly. Without Bill Finger, there would be no Batman as we know it, and it's all. Just for the sake of, again, not going off on too big of a Batman tangent, but here we are 7 years later. Bill Finger's name is officially now part of, and yet it's not Batman. It's not Bob Kane and Bill Finger like it's Siegel and Shuster. In the case of Bob Kane, it's Bob Kane with Bill Finger. Wow. And ladies and gentlemen, I guarantee you, there are literally billions of dollars separating the word "and" from the word "with." Right. Because I think DC had to settle with Athena Finger's granddaughter.
Right.
And I basically they negotiated because had it been "and," which is I'm sure what Athena Finger they were pushing for, I think they had to settle with, because had it been "and," like I said, it would have been billions, because Batman right now,
$1 billion, right?
Whatever it is, Batman is worth. He's he's the most valuable character, more than Superman. I don't know.
Right.
But
now he is. DC, I think, makes more money out of Batman than Superman.
Ever since the movies, the Dark Knight films, Batman's in the stratosphere.
Right.
But the point is, so without going off on a tangent about the Batman Bill Finger story, suffice it to say, they create Batman, and what is their origin? The origin of Batman is the parents of Bruce Wayne get killed in the street by a stick-up man. Now, once it was revealed only about a dozen years ago that Siegel's father had actually died as a result, who knows, and we can only as historians surmise this, Joel, but maybe since Batman's origin, by the way, they didn't do his origin until even a year later.
Right.
We don't know about the Bruce Wayne origin, I think, till 1940.
Right.
Batman's created in May of 1939. I don't think we get his origin. The point is,
it's not in there. Case of the chemical syndicate.
But what I'm saying is there are a bunch of Batman stories in Detective Comics before we get to his origin story.
Right.
The origin is not introduced like Superman right up front. It comes almost a year later, I believe.
Right.
But the reason I bring that up is that there is every possibility that Bill Finger and Bob Kane, working up at DC along with Siegel and Shuster at the time, might have heard through Siegel himself on the side, maybe confidentially, about how Siegel's father died.
Right.
And maybe that's what gave them the idea. Again, the problem with comic book history is that unlike a lot of other 20th century American pop culture forms like like rock and roll and movies and television. There isn't a lot of documentation of any of this history.
Direct
There's
documentation.
no paper trail. There's no interviews. I mean, unfortunately, this incredible 20th century art form that is of equal stature with movies, television, and rock and roll. All of their histories have been beautifully documented by major documentarians. And yet comic books, because there is so little documented history, it's really sad that all we can do as historians when we're discussing these issues is piece together what I call the forensic comic book evidence, which is meager, and try to come up with theories. So all I'm saying is, once we found out that Siegel's father was killed in a stick-up, that might have been, I stress the word might. It might have been why Bill Finger ends up writing Batman's origin about a stick-up man.
Right. A friend of mine, a very well-known artist, Archie Rand, has a theory that even though Batman is not overtly Jewish as a character, he seems more like Christian because it's gothic, he looks like a demon and everything like that. The villains are all stereotypes of kind of like European, German, Bund stereotypes of what Jews were. Like the Penguin is like the capitalist, and, Catwoman is like the kinky Jewish woman. And so he's saying if you look at like the Sturmer magazine in the 30s, they had pictures of Jews that looked a lot like Batman villains.
No. Okay, but look, take the Joker, for instance.
Right.
As far as we know, again, just based on the history we know, and there's a lot of documentation about the Joker. I don't think you could say that because the Joker, it seems, was clearly based on 3 visual, concrete influences, and that's the silent movie with what's his name? The Man Who Laughs. What's the actor's name? I know.
Conrad
Veidt.
And Jack Pierce of Frankenstein fame did the makeup.
Okay, and then you have the steeplechase character that looks like the Joker.
Right.
And then, according to Jerry Robinson, who claims he co-created both Robin and the Joker and used his name Robinson for Robin, but he claims he brought in the Joker playing card.
Right.
And the figure of the face of the Joker on the typical 1930s deck of cards.
Yes.
So if you combine, the point is I know what you mean about the Jewish stereotype of the villain is hawk-nosed.
Right.
I think your Penguin of the hawk-nose is more the Danny DeVito filmic Penguin.
Right.
The Penguin again comes in the late 40s or mid 40s, and Bob Kane claims he got him because of the Cool Cigarettes ad.
Right. It's more dapper.
Had a penguin. Okay, so here's the problem. When you're going to talk about Jews in comics, and listen, I've been accused of this too. We can read too much into it and not have the kind of evidence to back it up.
Yeah, that was not an evidence one.
But I'm saying,
letting you know that.
We've got to be careful to not go off on tangents like that because again, we have plenty of concrete evidence about other things about – and listen, speaking of Batman, vis-a-vis Jews in comics, and this is what we should really talk about, if Superman is both the Moses myth, in addition to an unconscious, subconscious retelling of what was happening in the world at the time of the late 30s, you also have the subconscious, unconscious idea that Superman could be the Moses myth. Because just like Moses, he was sent down the river to escape the Pharaoh who wanted to kill all the firstborn Jews. And, of course, the Jesus story is built on the Moses myth as well. So here's the thing with Superman. Superman is the Jewish subconscious or unconscious creation of a more angelic character come to earth to save us. Now, remember, Moses was a man. Yes, you have the myth of Moses leaving, as a boy, as a baby, leaving Pharaoh and being brought up. But the rest of it doesn't fit because Superman comes from space. He comes from the heavens down to earth. He's in it now. When you talk about Siegel's father getting murdered, basically, you almost can say, well, forget about the whole angelic being story. What you really have is Siegel subconsciously or unconsciously creating the ultimate father figure to replace the one that was murdered.
Right,
and Superman literally comes down from heaven, meaning his father returns from heaven to save the earth and to be the ultimate replacement father for Jerry's father who was murdered. And that is an absolutely psychologically valid theory. So
Freud said that about the Jews and because Freud was an atheist, but he was Jewish, and a lot of his books are about sublimation. Moses and Monotheism is his last book that's like really important. Talks about the origins of Judaism and stuff like that. And his belief is that God is really like an uber father figure, and
why do you think why do you think we call him Father?
Right.
Our Father. I mean, everything's Father. We are all God's children, so to speak.
Right.
Absolutely. We are okay. So the whole Father. But here's the thing. So if you're diagramming the origin of Superman vis-a-vis Jews and comics, you have Theory 1. He's a replacement father figure for his murdered father. Theory 2. He's the Moses myth. Theory 3. He's the Christ myth. For Jor-El so loved the earth, he gave his only begotten son with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. Right. Now, here's the thing. Jesus was created, the Jesus story was created by Jews, as was the Moses story. So the Jesus story was built. He was supposed to be, Christianity came to being as a replacement theology. It basically said everything the Old Testament pointed towards was fulfilled in Christ. We don't need the Mosaic law anymore. We don't need even the law anymore. We've got a better Moses. We've got Jesus. So the point is it was also created by Jews. So the idea of a supernatural being coming down to earth from the heavens is a Jewish idea.
Right.
It turned into Christianity, but it was a Jewish idea.
Right.
And then you get so those are to me the multiple theories. But then you get Batman. Now you see Batman, I think, is more of the Jewish assimilationist story of if you work hard enough, like Horatio Alger, the American dream. If you work hard enough, because you got to remember, yes, he got $1 billion from the Wayne Foundation, but essentially the story of Batman is about if you work hard and educate yourself, which is how Jews survived all the persecutions for thousands or hundreds of years, is that by education and hard work, you will succeed. And Batman is the story, if you get past the tragic origin, it's basically, if you apply yourself, I mean, what does Bruce Wayne do? From 8 years old to when he's 28. For 20 years.
He studied a million subjects,
He's like the ultimate yeshiva student. He studies. He becomes as smart as you can become and as physically fit as you can become.
Right.
And now that's not a particularly Jewish ideal, but what it essentially is, if you're going to talk about it under the rubric of Jews and comics, it is essentially how to make it in American society as a Jew. If you work hard, but again, that's the But you see, the American dream is a Jewish American dream.
Right.
Essentially.
Right.
And that's what, all the immigrant classes have done from the get-go, is you come to this country. And the American dream, which is about freedom. I mean, what is Judaism? Judaism was a struggle for freedom from the get-go. Even the Canaanites, according to some historians, the Canaanites that were there before the Jews, they were struggling against the upper classes that lived on a higher plane. And the rest of the Canaanites lived on a lower plane. And the Canaanites on the higher plane, big surprise, lorded it over the Canaanites on the lower plane.
Right.
And they were struggling for their freedom. And according to one, historical way of looking at the origins of the Jewish people as a small band, not a large throng of slaves, But a small band of Jewish slaves leaves Egypt, wanders in the desert, encounters a Arabian tribe of some type that is praying to this invisible god named...
Yeah, it's Midianites. That's the Midianite theory. Yeah.
I think the god was named Yahoo, not Yahweh. Yahoo.
It's a variant,
So what happens, according to this, I saw this on the History Channel, this band of slaves merges with these Midianites. They go up into Canaan, the land of Israel, and they merge with these Canaanite groups that have been struggling for their freedom against the upper class Canaanites.
Right. And it's these city-states, and it collapses, and then those Jews
they merge, and those three groups merge and become the Jewish people. And then they end up writing this all down, and basically they retrofit history to make it look like it was all God-inspired.
Right. Well,
now, I'm being very cynical.
Right.
I'm being, I'm sure there are Jews.
That's one theory, though. That's a secular theory, sure.
But that's a secular theory.
Yeah.
Okay, so
could we wait? So moving back, because there's a couple of ways to go with this. One thing is like in the Superman story, like the pressure of American Jews in that way to kind of fit in. You know what I mean? Because they're coming from this, So that whole thing of Clark Kent wearing glasses, the whole thing of And Siegel had said, he based it on what's his name, the silent film, Harold Lloyd, the silent film comedian. But the whole thing of Jews wearing glasses, the whole things of Jews being like seen as nerdy, that whole thing.
Well,
and then,
listen, you got to remember.
Yeah.
Jews were primarily the people of the book.
Right.
They were intellectuals. They were artists. They were not big, tough, strong guys.
Well, they were pushed into shtetls also. You know what I mean? They lived 1,000 years in these like cramped quarters.
Of course,
and weren't
but
allowed
my
to work
point
out
is
and all that stuff.
The stereotype of the Jew does not bring to mind a 6'2", muscle build.
Absolutely. So
the point is, Jews come to this country. They're beaten up. They're pushed around. They're ridiculed. They're Christ killers. They're blah, blah, blah. But what did Jews do in America? Like they've done everywhere. They end up succeeding. It doesn't mean they're not persecuted, but they end up succeeding in America like never before in anywhere in the world.
Right.
Until the state of Israel was created in 1948, America was, are you kidding? America was like going to Eden.
Right.
To European Jews that had been through hundreds, thousands of years of persecution.
Right.
And yes, even though there were still problems in America, like there still are, listen, there are more incidents of anti-Semitism in the Trump era than against any other minority by like sevenfold. It's not even close.
Right.
So we're still number one. Don't forget that.
New York City, it's 50% of bias crimes is against Jews.
Either way, the point is we're still number one, baby.
Right.
We're still number one.
Right.
Anyway, but I want to get back to Batman being the kind of flip side of the Jewish idea of the angelic being coming to save us. Batman represents us, human beings, trying to act godlike, trying to act heroically.
Strive. Right. Those who
using
strive.
And if you want to talk about Bruce Wayne and his wealth, well, then you get the stereotype of the Jews who did do well and became wealthy, whether it was in manufacturing, whether it was in whatever businesses that Jews were allowed, owning slums. The reason why there's so much black anti-Semitism is that Jews weren't allowed to own the good property. Christians own the good property. What did they allow Jews to own? The crappy property nobody wanted, the slums. And that's why Jews became slumlords. Joel, you there?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Oh.
Anyway.
Sound like you went away for a while.
No, it's just that could we share, because there's a lot of points.
What are you laughing at? I sense you laughing. What do you find so funny?
Not laughing. Well, we got from superheroes to Jews in the slums and everything. So it's
well,
interesting.
Hello, it's all part of it.
It's all part of it. Yeah.
The point is well, I'm just saying that wraps up the Superman Batman. It's twin. It's the yin yang of the Jewish idea of the hero. He
Right.
either comes from on high to save us,
Right.
which is the Superman myth, or he's self-made. He's a Batman, or
He
in the case
strives
of Captain
from-
America,
Right.
he is aided by scientific development, and Jews were always into science, and there are a great many Jewish scientists. I mean, in all fields of education and learning,
Absolutely.
Jews have disproportionately done well. So Superman is the angel come down from heaven to save us.
Right.
You know, Batman is the self-made American Jew, you know, that works hard and does well. Captain America is the Jew created to be a hero by science. Right? Those are the three American super
Absolutely.
archetypes.
And it's interesting that Kirby made him blonde. You know, Simon and Kirby. You know, like so it's almost like just like Kirby changing his name to be more like, say, you know, Jimmy Cagney, who was his hero, or something like that.
Listen, this is how Jews assimilated.
Absolutely.
There were no comic characters named Irving Forbish.
Right.
To quote,
but what I'm saying is that Kirby, for even
Steve
changing
Rogers,
his name, is probably the most Jewish. Like in terms of his ideas, in terms of his affiliation. Yeah, never was afraid to show it. I mean, as you know, there's stories of like Nazis and gangsters trying to shake them down at Timely, and Kirby, like the Nazis were threatening them because of Captain America, and he goes, "Let me get down there. Let me go and fight them." You know what I mean? Like Kirby was that kind of guy.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, he stood up for it. He fought back.
Right.
And yes, it is ironic that a guy that siphoned so much of his Jewish experience into his comics. Right. I mean, listen, it wasn't revealed until only a dozen years ago that, we're making the Thing Jewish. Well, there's a picture in my webinar where the Thing is wearing a yarmulke and has a towel.
Right, Kirby did that for his grandkids' bar mitzvah.
But you see, listen, but that's part of the Jewish experience in pop culture.
Right.
They always end up being behind the scenes. You know, and I'm going to go off on a tangent here. You know that Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the famous the show that made Will Smith famous?
Sure.
Do you know that was based on a true story about a black kid in Philly named Benny something or other. He gets in trouble with the law, and his family ships him out to Beverly Hills. Now, the TV show, who does he end up living with in Beverly Hills?
His rich uncle or something. Yeah, his rich uncle or something.
Yeah. The rich, but it was a rich black family in Beverly Hills.
Right.
But guess what the true story was based on? The true story is a black kid from Philly gets sent to live with a white, wealthy Jewish family in Beverly Hills.
Oh, it wasn't his relatives, or?
This is what I'm telling you, Joel. The true story was about a black kid that ends up getting sent to Beverly Hills to live with a white Jewish family. Right. And he ends up reforming himself thanks to this wealthy white Jewish family.
Right.
By the way, do you know who raised Satchmo, Louis Armstrong?
No.
A Jewish family.
Wow.
Louis Armstrong wore a Star of David around his neck his whole life because he feels like this Jewish family, in a sense, saved his life and raised him.
Right.
But the point I'm trying to make, Joel, is in American culture, Jews have been told, don't make a scene, keep your head down.
Right, keep it down low. Keep it down low, absolutely.
So the Jewish creators end up creating a show with Will Smith that doesn't stay true to life. They end up changing it from a Jewish family in Beverly Hills to a black family.
Right.
Which, again, makes for a good story. It's just not the truth.
Right.
Now, remember the filmmaker Barry Levinson, Jewish filmmaker.
Absolutely. Diner and all that. Yeah, sure.
He makes this movie about 15 years ago or so, maybe longer, called Avalon. Right. And it was all about his upbringing as a Jewish kid in Baltimore.
Right. Baltimore,
but here's the thing.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. He himself self-edited his movie. He wanted it to appeal to all Americans. He didn't want it to be a Jewish story. So what did he do? He actually changed everything in the movies and the characters to be generic Americans. They didn't celebrate the Jewish holidays. They were celebrating Thanksgiving. None of them, in other words, he purposely avoided any overt Jewish thing. And I remember watching this movie go, are you kidding me, Barry Levinson? You don't have the balls I mean, and this is what I'm saying. Jews have
Right.
bent over backwards
Right.
to hide their Jewish. You know, for every Steven Spielberg who stands up for his Judaism and says, I'm going to create the Shoah Foundation, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I'll never forget Gary Shandling was on David Letterman
Right.
once. And I'm a big fan of both guys. And I'll never forget Letterman at one point in the conversation kind of naturally segues something about and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, you're Jewish. And I'll never forget Gary Shandling's reaction to being referred to as Jewish on national television. It was almost the equivalent of being outed as a gay man. His reaction.
I'm sure he responded like he was being punched in the face or something.
I'm telling you, he wanted to push that topic on, and even I'll never forget Letterman was even taken aback, like, sorry, Gary, like I did. In other words, and I'll never forget, watch this going, Gary Shandling, I can't believe you're this embarrassed about being called out for being Jewish, and the fact that you think it's like you're being called out. So, you know, this is the problem with American Jews in general, is that, and this gets back to Jews in comics, the fact that in the modern era, more American Jewish comic creators have come out.
Yeah, it could be more overt. Certainly in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was all kind of under the surface. It had to be, pretty much.
It was, and again, it was all about being perceived as, especially in the 60s, when we threw away all the old world ideas of love, marriage, everything. And we were Americans. We weren't Jews. And I remember all of my female cousins who were a couple of years older than me, all married. They were all raised Jewish, all got bat mitzvahed. You know, their parents were, you know, not, my family were secular Jews, but we went to temple like everybody else on the high holy days. The point is, Joel, all three girls married non-Jews.
Right.
Because they came of age in the 60s when they saw American Jewish men of their age range as being materialistic, as being part of the establishment. And they basically were attracted to Gentiles. And I'm telling you, a whole generation intermarried because of the 60s. And they thought of themselves as Americans first and Jews second. Right.
I know Gary Shandling would just say he was a Buddhist or something. That's what he said later in life.
Yeah, and maybe that's why. All I'm saying is that incident stuck with me. And so many Jewish celebrities, people don't even realize they're Jewish. Everybody from Scarlett Johansson to, I mean, the list is endless. I mean, Jon Stewart from The Daily Show. His name is Jon Stewart Lefkowitz. I mean, the list of American Jews who have changed their names or people don't realize they're Jewish is just, like I said, it's an endless. You know, people don't realize the guy that invented the Cheetos was Jewish. The woman that invented Barbie for Mattel was Jewish. I mean, most of what passes for American pop culture is actually Jewish American culture.
Or influenced, So
whether it's music, rock and roll, movies, television. You know, we wouldn't have had Batman on television if it wasn't for a bunch of Jewish executives.
Right.
The guy that was supposedly at the Hefner party in 1964 where they were making fun of the Batman serials, he was a Jewish executive. He went back, and who ended up producing it? William Dozier, Jewish executive. You know, the point is, if you made all the anti-Semites in America happy, and you eliminated the Jewish influence on American popular culture, and this is what gay people say, by the way. They say if you took away the gays from American culture, you'd be left with nothing. And guess what? A lot of those gays were Jewish too. So if you took away American Jews and their gay brethren, you would have white bread. You'd have like America would be like Singapore.
Right.
Like there'd be no culture. It would be like a George Orwell, like
Singapore. But
you know what? It would be everybody walking around in
bland white bread, nothing.
Yeah,
It'd be like
so
George Goebel in the 50s, and like that. It would be. Yeah.
All of you anti-Semites listening in tonight.
Right.
Without Jews, America would be totally flat.
Right. The joke is that the two greatest songs in America is White Christmas and Easter Parade, and they're both written by Irving Berlin. Easter Parade is a woman with a hat, and White Christmas is a festival about snow.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So there you go.
Listen.
Yeah.
Jews, listen. Again, I don't want to go off a tangent, but we gave the pagan world God through a man named Jesus Christ. That is our gift to the world, is you would have been pagans praying to idols with blood sacrifices. If it wasn't for what we gave you our God, but in the form of a man that you could believe in him easier than believing in an invisible God, which is a very hard concept to believe in.
Right. Could we shift here for a second, because we're talking a lot, but because we were talking privately about Kirby and stuff, so I wanted to kind of just touch base about Kirby, because there's so much stuff that I'm convinced that about Jewish religion and stuff like that penetrated into Kirby,
Right.
Okay. Well, I don't want to jump to the, like, say in the Silver Age, there's this stuff with, you were talking about that in your other webinar about, say, X-Men, like the mutants and X-Men standing in for actually Jewish people originally, and then it wasn't Kirby, but originally Magneto was supposed to be a gypsy or something, but later they really made him Jewish and coming out of Auschwitz and stuff like that. But
but that wasn't Kirby.
Right. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about was the whole thing about the God thing. Like it's a couple of concepts like that. Fantastic Four and Galactus and the Silver Surfer. Right. So that's like a God concept and an angel concept. You were talking about that before, right? And how that plays into Thor and how that goes into the New Gods. Because there seems to be, and I to explain to everybody too, like Kirby worked at Marvel during the Silver Age, really was the architect of the Marvel Universe, even though they claim that, it was Stan Lee. Stan Lee seems more like the editor and kind of put words to Kirby's ideas. The designs were all Kirby. The characters seem totally like Kirby. We're going to talk, you talked about, backing up a little, you were talking about the Golem, right? So you have two Golems, actually. You have Ben Grimm, who was the Golem, because he's an orange rock monster. And you have the Thing, which is, you have the Hulk, which is also like a Golem, like he's Frankenstein, but he's really like the Golem. He's both, And the Hulk is even more like the Golem, because the Hulk goes out of control. Like Ben Grimm is a nice guy. He's a tough guy from Yancey Street, which is really Delancey Street, which is 2 blocks from where Kirby grew up. Right? So that think of gangs of Yancey Street or whatever that Kirby wrote into it. The Hulk is even more like the Golem, because he gets out of control. Like you brought up the thing about the Golem before. The word Golem means unformed spirit. And so you had brought this up, but we didn't talk about it tonight. So one of the main myths about the Golem is that he has the word truth written on his forehead. The word truth in Hebrew is emet. Okay? If you take the aleph off, the E off, right, the front letter becomes met, which is death. And then the Golem collapses into a pile of dust.
And that's how he puts the Golem down.
Right. Now, in the 1920 movie, which was UFA, was the German movie, is Paul Wegener or Paul Wegener in English.
Right.
It's a great movie, and if you could see it, it's a silent movie. It's a great monster design that was very influential to the Universal Monsters and stuff like that.
Right.
They have him. It's a variant of the myth. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's kind of a variant of that myth. But that character of the Golem is so clearly both the Hulk and the Thing. It's like ridiculous, and it plays out in that way. And like you're saying, in Kirby's mind, he did that card. I think it was for his grandkids. He did something for his grandkids' bar mitzvah and a Hanukkah card. So the stuff on the internet is the Hanukkah card where he has
the
thing.
I said that in a yarmulke and talis.
And a talis and a prayer book. He's holding a sitter, actually. So it's really overt. And when he was asked, Kirby said, the Thing is me. Like, I'm the Thing. I'm a nice guy, but I'm tough and, kind of gruff, and I get the job done and all that kind of stuff, What happens in the Galactus story is, and I'm going to go a little bit on a tangent here, so just bear with me, right? So Galactus is the planet eater, right? And he's kind of like the horrible God. He's not like the good God because he's indiscriminately destroys and everything like that, right? And like you were saying, the Silver Surfer is this character that rides the surfboard in the spaceways and everything like that. He's like the fallen angel, right? And
well,
so
hold on.
Yeah.
Slow down.
Yeah.
Before he's the fallen angel, he's a herald.
He's his
of
herald.
Galactus.
Right, he's his
seeking.
herald. Right.
He's Galactus's herald, finding worlds for him to consume.
Right,
and he never was. He had no emotions. He was like Spock. He never got attached to any world that Galactus would devour until he comes to Earth. And in the same way, the Old Testament stories of the original angels that came to Earth and supposedly in these apocryphal stories of Genesis, they mate with Earth women,
Nephilim.
And the
Nephilim.
And they were these giants that were, because they were half God, they were like demigods. They were half God and half man. So this idea that the Silver Surfer interacts with mankind, and by empathizing with it, like the story of Satan, he basically challenges God and says, I mean, there are many stories of the devil and Satan, but the basic story is that Satan was one of God's angels that he created that basically challenges God and encourages the other angels to say, you know, we don't have to do what God is telling us. We've got our own. And basically is punished by God and thrown down to earth. And supposedly those angelic beings have become the devil and demons that live under or inside the earth. That is one theory. And
let me
Silver Surfer, hold on. I just want to get back. So Silver Surfer, by being punished by Galactus for daring to interfere with his plans and sympathizing with the Earth people like Satan did, he gets punished by being thrown down to Earth. So then the Surfer becomes the fallen angel. I just wanted to fill in that little gap there.
Good. There's an alternative to this too, because the whole thing with Satan as the fallen angel is not in the Hebrew Bible, right? So there is.
Where does that come from? Where does that come from?
It's part of the Apocrypha of the New Testament. It's not part of the rebellion of the angels. Is not part of the Hebrew Bible. All right, but there is something very similar. Okay, so you ready for this? Okay.
Yeah.
So when the Jews came back from Persia, Cyrus lets them go back to Persia, right? The Jews got very friendly with the Zoroastrians, okay? Zoroastrianism is a Persian religion that's dualistic, okay? So in other words, they believe, and that's where it comes from about God and the devil fighting. It comes out of Zoroastrianism originally, which, 500 or 1,000 years earlier, okay? So there's a God of creation, right? It's a gross God of matter. And then there's a nicer, newer God, right? I'm sorry, wait, I'm jumping a little. Okay, no. There's a God of creation, and then there's an evil God. So it's Ahriman and Ahura Mazda. So it's this conflict between light and darkness. Okay, so they're even, basically. And they fight forever, okay? Flash forward so the Jews bring back these ideas, right? And dualism, as you know, is not really part of Judaism, like that. Like there's a good God and bad God. It's not part of it yet, okay? A couple of hundred years later, this influences a religion called Gnosticism, right? And there's three groups of Gnostics. There are Christian Gnostics, pagan Gnostics, and Jewish Gnostics, right? Now, I'm getting this out of Gershom Scholem, who's probably the greatest expert on Jewish mysticism. He wrote in Germany and the United States, and he wrote all about the introduction to Kabbalah.
Okay, Joe, you got to bring it back. We're running out of time.
Okay, I'm gonna. Okay, so if you got Galactus is really, in Gnosticism, there's this like gross God of matter that's kind of evil or something like that, right? That's like Galactus. That's exactly like Galactus, okay? The flip side of that is this younger God, and in Christianity, right, it's Jesus or it's Christ, right?
Of course, Son of Man,
right? But in Judaism, they didn't accept that, right? And so it becomes this other thing. And if you mentioned this before, in the book of Enoch, right, they introduced the Watchers, which Kirby and Stanley had to know about, because in Fantastic Four, Uatu, the Watcher, is there. And it introduces, that's the kind of advent of the character of Metatron, who's the archangel. Okay, and in Judaism starts out in that book of Enoch, right? So you have Metatron and the Watchers both in the book of Enoch. Okay. By medieval times in Jewish mysticism, Metatron becomes so powerful that they call him the lesser Yahweh or the lesser God. So in other words, even within the monotheism of Judaism, that Jewish mystics believe that there's God who's like, the high king, and there's Metatron. And Metatron is like the Watcher. He does the records for God. He records whether you do good or badly. He has a cube, okay, like the cosmic cube. It's called the cube of Metatron. And it shoots beams of light, has all this power in it. So these motifs.
So let me ask you something.
Yeah.
Let me ask something, just to bring it back to Kirby, because I think we got to wrap up soon, and maybe I'll ask Barbara if there's any thoughts.
Sure. I definitely think he heard this stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's in the end what we need to know is, was Kirby consciously aware? Because we know he was a voracious reader of Popular Mechanics magazine, knew all about science.
He read sci-fi a lot.
But do you think he also, in a sense, was a deep reader of some of this mystical Jewish thought? Do you think it consciously affected his work to come up with these characters, or do you think Kirby, as just this almost idiot savant of creativity, and as a Jewish descendant of this collective unconsciousness of Jewish mythical creationism, would, in a sense, come up with on his own? Or do you think he was consciously aware of these ideas you're talking about?
He never said this. You know what I mean? But when I encountered this material, it's so parallel. It sounds so the same.
So do you think, Joe? And let's end on this.
He might have heard it.
There's any phone calls. Do you think? That's what I'm saying. Do you think in
he might have heard it
or read about it? What do you mean heard it?
Yeah. But listen, he was a kid on the Lower East Side. There were yeshivas all over the Lower East Side.
But hold on, I'm talking about later in life. Look, he creates Galactus when he's in his mid-40s.
Right.
I'm saying, he claims, and I quote in my Silver Age book.
Right.
He says, when I came to Galactus, I was looking for God, and I found it in Galactus. So when Kirby makes statements like that, there is every possibility that in the early 60s, when Kirby's in his early 40s, he might have come across this Jewish mystical text.
Sure.
And then he might have come across it in 1965 when he creates Galactus. And so it might have been literally when he found out about that stuff and said, this is great material. I'm going to put it into Fantastic Four. Why not?
Absolutely. And it follows up into the New Gods, like the whole thing follows. Like the theology of Thor. He wanted to end at Marvel. They wouldn't let him. He leaves Marvel. He goes to DC, and then he starts the whole Fourth World, which is
now on that note, Joel, the Fourth World. I will be doing a webinar on the 50th anniversary of the Fourth World. On October 29th, a Thursday night at 9 p.m. And again,
I'll be there.
For all of my webinars, you go to NewYorkAdventureClub.com or NYAdventureClub.com and just scroll through their smorgasbord calendar of offerings, and you'll find things like my Jews and Comics webinar next Wednesday day, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I hope all my European Jewish friends who are into comics will be listening in live, because it's only dinner time, your time. But let me ask Barbara, who's listening in. It's 9:45. Joel and I have come to a nice end. Are there any people waiting to call in?
Not at the moment, but I'd keep going. I'll let you know if there are.
Okay.
So we got like 15.
Barbara, how long should we talk? For another 10 minutes?
Well, you've got 15 minutes and 40 seconds, so fill it as you will.
Okay. So Joel, we got a nice chunk of time for anything we want to segue from or talk about. You can pick up where we left off with Kirby and Galactus,
we can move on if you want to. I mean, just reading the material.
You're my guest.
Reading the material.
Okay, wait. How about this?
Yeah.
Since I'm totally self-serving.
Yes.
Since the whole point of this radio show is to help sell tickets to my webinar,
yes.
I would like you to wax poetic ad nauseum, or at least for another couple of minutes, and tell people how you experience my Jews and Comics lecture, which is a video of when I did it a couple of years ago at the prestigious 92nd Street Y in New York City.
Right.
It's on my YouTube channel. You can find it. Everything's linked from my website. But I had thought Joel had seen my Jews and Comics lecture, but it turns out that when I invited Joel on this radio talk show tonight, it turns out he had never seen my Jews and Comics lecture, which my webinar is based on, and he ended up watching it. And now, Joel, I'll hand the microphone over to you. Tell the listener about my Jews and Comics webinar, because that's how I want to end the show, where we segue into buying a ticket and supporting your local Jewish artists.
Right. So listen, like Arlen said, we know each other 8 or 10 years. We've been good friends for about 5, 6, I guess. I was really moved because, and it sounds like kind of corny, like I'm, like Saturday Night Live, like verklempt, I'm going to cry or something. Anyway, the reason why it was really on the mark and so good was that he started with the early comic book industry. He goes through, the big 3 or 4, Superman and Batman and Captain America, and the big 3 or 4 big creators, Siegel and Shuster and Bob Kane and Will Eisner and Kirby, Simon and Kirby, and then, and then he goes into the 50s and Mad Magazine and EC Comics, which we didn't get to talk about tonight, but Mad and EC was so influential, not just on comics, but American humor, American television. Yep. Saturday Night Live comes out of Mad Magazine. I mean, and my experience with Mad as a kid in EC was really from reproductions, because I discovered them,
a whole generation did from those paperback books.
Those paperback books, exactly.
You want to know something? Wait, let me interrupt for 1 second.
Yeah.
I saw It's a Hard Day's Night on Turner Classic Movies the other night.
Right.
And I hadn't seen the movie in a long time. And one of the early scenes while they're on the train, the manager's buddy, Shake, is reading one of the Mad Magazine paperbacks.
Really? Yeah, so that was the mood.
Okay, but keep in mind, this is 1964 when those books were coming out, and those paperback books were reprints of the early Mad when it was a comic book, mostly spoofing other comics.
Super Duper Man, Starchy, all that stuff.
But to a whole generation of baby boomers that only knew Mad as a magazine under the editorship of Feldstein since the mid-'50s, had really no idea. There weren't a lot of history publications back then. There weren't any books about the history of comics. A whole generation was exposed to these early Mad issues of comics via these paperback books that Bantam started putting out in the early 60s. And that created, that whole generation ended up being the underground comic generation.
Right, absolutely.
Ended up but it was those Mad paper. Okay, so I digress.
Right. So, let me wax some more, and then we'll get back to Mad for a second. But I was very taken with not only in 90 minutes, Arlen hits all the beats, like all the proper people he should hit. He does it in this way that's very fluid. He does it in this way that's a kind of narrative that flows one part into the next, and it builds up to this great crescendo. Because, we're not going to get to this tonight, but again, not only does it go from Will Eisner to Spiegelman's Mouse to the Rabbi's Cat to the Golem's Mighty Swing. There's been a million. Again, through Jewish Comic Con, I got exposed to it. So many Jewish artists who are doing all kinds of issues. Right now. So I just wanted to kind of thank Arlen and say that he did a great job. I was kind of really moved, not just because he was doing it so well, but it got me in touch with the content itself and how amazingly rich the subject matter is and how it should be told as a whole narrative. And he really did a wonderful job with that. So.
Well, let me just say in response, not only thank you for those kind words, but the fact that I could make an artist of Joel's stature, and when you look at his work at JoelSilversteinArt.com?
Yeah, JoelSilversteinArt.com.
Website?
Yeah.
If you go and see Joel's work and you see how he's incorporated comic book-based imagery into his paintings, along with, of course, Jewish philosophy and theory and history.
Yeah.
But the fact that a guy like Joe, who's one of the very few fine artists that knows his comics, and vice versa, most fine artists, they've used comics, like Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, they used comics. I don't really think they were comic book fans, so to speak, that knew the comics like we who call ourselves comic book fans or historians. So for a guy like Joel with his background to come to my Jews and Comics lecture only recently and to come to it fresh and have that reaction. And listen, as a creator, as a presenter, as a performer, the highest thing you can do with an audience is make them feel something.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
make them feel something positive, something that makes them introspect, something that makes them think. It's no different than being a teacher and hoping that if you only reach one student, it's worth it.
Right.
One person can change the world for better or for worse. The same guy that created the state of Israel in concept, Theodor Herzl, came out of Austria at the same time that a guy that was dedicated to the eradication of Judaism.
Right.
Adolf Hitler came out of Austria. You can change the world for better or for worse.
Right.
So all I'm saying is I was very touched by Joel's reaction. It was unexpected because, A, I thought you had already seen it years ago. So my webinar is, listen, in this pandemic, I've been fortunate to hook up with New York Adventure Club and able to do these webinars, which I used to do live for either colleges, universities, comic conventions. Maybe people listening in have seen me. I used to lecture at the San Diego Comic Convention. But I was lucky to be able to translate all of my former live lectures to this webinar medium, which was an easy transition since I'm a semi-computer Luddite. And that's why the webinar you'll see next week on Wednesday the 16th at 1 p.m., and you can buy a ticket. And by the way, the ticket's only $10, number one. And number two, even if you can't see the webinar live, which a lot of people, they don't buy a ticket because, I can't make it on Wednesday at 1 p.m., I'm working or whatever. Buying a ticket allows you to see a recording of the live webinar for up to a week afterwards whenever you want to. So the recording of the live webinar, when you watch it later, is literally just like being there, except you can't interact with it like people that are watching it live. There's always a lively chat board where people interact. But I just want to let people listening in know that buying a ticket gives you the availability to the webinar for up to a week.
Right.
So that's why I was particularly moved by Joel. And Joel, I think I'm going to leave it up to you as my guest for a closing statement on whatever you want to talk about vis-a-vis Jews and comics.
Okay. I guess as a plug also, I wanted to plug my organization. Yona Verver is the president. It's called the Jewish Art Salon. We're the largest Jewish artist group in the whole world, 400 people worldwide, and my friend Richard McBee. So I wanted to plug them because we do have a comic book and graphic novelists in our group, but also painters and designers and all kinds of people. And as a statement, I would say this, that, Jews and comics is it's this amazing subject that never stops delivering information and inspiration. And I think the more you read about it from the very beginnings, from the late 20s, early 30s, the more you realize it's really the history of American Jewry. It's really the same story of struggle, assimilation, creating American Jewry, creating, like what Arlen was saying, comics, TV, everything. It's the Jewish story.
The Jews who created Hollywood. Neil Gabler wrote a famous book.
Right, I read it. Yeah.
What was that called? I forget.
An Empire of Their Own.
Right. It's in fact, in my webinar, I show images of the three Hollywood moguls that were Jewish, Mayer, Goldwyn, and Warner, and I compare them visually to Harry Donenfeld and Leibowitz and Max Gaines as the three moguls who basically started the comic book industry. And by the way, it was Sheldon Mayer, a Jew, who picks those Siegel and Shuster comic strip auditions of Superman out of a slush pile because Gaines tells them they need something for Action Comics #1, this new comic that they were going to debut, because Detective Comics #1 was so successful a year before, the first comic book of original material built around a single theme, detectives. Detective is where Batman was born. So, it's great to bring our conversation, Joel, which has been going on for an hour and 45 minutes, full circle. We began with Siegel and Shuster creating Superman, trying to sell him as a comic strip from 1933 to 1938, rejected like every success story, rejected by everyone. And then what do? They sell it because Sheldon Mayer is intrigued by the very Jewish idea that we talked about of the Clark Kent Superman dichotomy that he intuited was the American assimilation story of Judaism, was this Clark Kent that he really is Superman. He's not Clark Kent, but he chooses, just like Jesus chose to become a man and live his life as a man, so too did Superman choose to live his life like a Gentile American from Kansas. You can't get any more assimilationist than that. And on that note, Joel, I want to thank you for being a trooper and talking with me for so long. But like I said to you, Joel, earlier this week when we talked, I said, Joel, I bet you we could fill up 2 hours and we'll never get past Superman, Batman, and Captain America. But I knew
we didn't even touch on half the stuff.
Half the stuff. We literally never got past Captain America. But I knew because listen, I knew that the subject is so rich, like you said, it is so rich and there's so much to it that once you start talking about it, you barely get through it. But I want to let people know, and I'll end with this, for my webinar, I make it a point to go through the entire history, starting with Superman and the early comic book creation of Max Ginzburg, who changed his name to Gaines, up to current Jewish artists like Ben Katcher and J.T. Waldman and other American Jewish artists that are doing significant bodies of work. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Barbara DeLong of Nightlight Radio for giving me this incredible platform. I want to thank you, Joel, for being my lovely guest. And go to joelsilversteinart.com. I'm at arlenschumer.com, ARLEN like a Norman, SCHUM as in Marvin, ER. And from that, everything is linked. But go to nyadventureclub.com for all of my webinars. I have webinars almost once a week through into December on everything from comic book history to pop culture. I'm doing one on Roy Lichtenstein in September. I'm doing one on the 60th anniversary of the Flintstones, the 61st anniversary of the Twilight Zone. I mentioned the Jack Kirby one. I'm doing another James Bond webinars about the first 4 films and so much stuff. But reach out to me on Facebook, and you can reach out to me through my website. You can email me from there, and I'll be in touch with you. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Joel, I'll see you next week at my webinar for Jews and Comics, Wednesday, the 16th, right before Rosh Hashanah, at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at New York Adventure Club. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll see you, by the way, next time on Nightlight Radio with the minute I have left on Thursday night, September 17th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to talk about the webinar I'm doing after Jews and Comics, which is on Bruce Springsteen's single greatest show, which was September 19th, 1978. So on the eve of its 42nd anniversary, on Friday the 18th, I'm doing a webinar on that great show at 12 noon. But the night before at 9 p.m., I'll be doing my next Nightlight Radio show here on Nightlight Radio. So again, just keep track of at my blog at arlenschumer.com for all my upcoming things. Barbara, thank you very much, and I'll see you in a week and a half. Bye-bye, everybody.
Absolutely. Good night.